Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of State of Cybercrime. I'm one of your hosts, Matt Radalek, and I'm joined by one of my favorite people in the world.
I am another one of your hosts, David Gibson, and I am also one of I'm something about favorite people. Let's do it.
We always like to start out with the show with good news, as oftentimes cybersecurity is all doom and gloom, but there is a lot of good news going on in cyber. Specifically, this week, Operation Sentinel, an Interpol coordinated collaboration of 19 different African nations, led to the arrest of over 570 suspects. The Interpol 2025 Africa Cyber Threat Assessment revealed that business email compromise, digital extortion, and ransomware were the top cyber threats facing the nation. And this several months long initiative led to the takedown of more than 6,000 sites, and six different ransomware variants were decrypted. Interpol does warn, though, that cybercrime across Africa is accelerating.
Interesting stuff. I'm glad to see that for the good guys. This is some more good news, but it also feels a little icky for me. The good news is that two members of Black Cat are set for sentencing on March 12th. Uh, they extorted millions in ransom from multiple U.S. organizations, several organizations. There was one big medical device firm hit. They had this arrangement with Black Cat where 20% of what they extorted from their victims went to Black Cat to maintain their platform. When they're sentencing, it looks like they could get up to 20 years in prison. What's icky is that they were cybersecurity professionals. They were, and it looks like an incident response manager and a ransomware negotiator. So it's people turning to the dark side, right, Matt?
Yeah, white hat hacker by day, black hat by night. I guess they were tired of watching the bad guys get the big checks and they tried it themselves, but it doesn't look like it worked out for them.
Indeed. And I think this is a reminder that everyone should use their powers only for good.
Speaking of which, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, charged 54 suspects related to a multi-million dollar ATM scheme utilizing the Ploutus malware. What happened is the attackers would surveil ATMs and then install malware on them via hard drive swaps or by attaching external devices, which caused them to dispense cash. The suspects, if convicted, would each face 20 plus years in prison. The particular attack this is called is jackpotting, which is where an ATM kind of behaves like a slot machine and spits out cash as if you hit the jackpot. Some of those ATMs got hit multiple times.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. Apparently, the way this is installed is they open up the hood of the ATM machine and either replace the hard drive or plug in
Like
a
stick in a
malicious
USB
USB key.
stick. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's where this malware comes from.
Pretty novel stuff. Now let's jump on to our newest segment, AI They, which is surely going to leave you saying AI They. Now, what's going on with cloud? I know you're a big fan of this, David.
I believe I've talked about Claude Code before, and I think I also conveyed that I'm pretty impressed with it. Apparently, I'm not the only one. Some folks at Google have talked about how they're impressed with it too. Some engineers at Google apparently had been working on a project for about a year. It was a distributed AI agentic orchestration system. And one of the engineers, as an experiment, fed three paragraphs about the project into Claude Code. And it built something surprisingly close in an hour. Now, it's important to know they said that it's not enterprise grade code, but it's still surprisingly high quality. They called it a toy version. So, what this reminds me of, Matt, I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek, but some people out there probably did. There was a thing called the replicator where you kind of tell it, I'd like some chicken Alfredo, and then you'd open up the door and it was there, it would materialize. Claude Code is starting to remind me of that for software. That in the beginning, the software it created was not edible at all, but now it kind of tastes pretty good. It's just it maybe not all that healthy, right? If they're using seed oil and maybe too much salt, but it just keeps getting better and better. And I'm not sure how long it'll be before it's a lot like the replicator in Star Trek for software.
Yeah, that's not a bad analogy, David. I know you're a big Trekkie.
I am. I think it's Trekker.
Yeah, speaking of other popular TV shows from our youth, a hacktivist Martha Root took to the stage at the Chaos Communication Congress in Hamburg to announce that they had remotely deleted the servers of three white supremacist groups, White Data, White Child, and White Deal, mainly due to poor security practices. Martha Root was able to gather photos, including geolocation and other data, like personal data, about the operators of the site before deleting them. They have made the data available, but is limiting it only to verified journalists and researchers. Um, Completely unrelated, but the Pink Power Ranger is an aerial combat specialist that uses a bow and is the emotional leader in the Power Rangers.
That's probably the most important thing I learned today.
Now, what's going on? This whole reprompt story, which is a huge vulnerability in AI. David, what's going on with that?
Apparently, attackers are interested in what people are saying at the prompt to AI. And it turns out that browser extensions, or I guess malicious browser extensions, are a good way to snoop, or I guess what's called prompt poaching now. And two extensions were found recently to be exfiltrating user conversations and all the Chrome tab URLs to a remote command and control server every 30 minutes. So the way this works is they impersonate legitimate extensions. They do ask for permissions to collect data for analytics, and of course, I'm sure everybody reads those to know what they're signing up for. But it, I guess there are two of them: ChatGPT for Chrome with GPT-5, AI sidebar with DeepSeek, ChatGPT, Claude. More, it's they're using lovable web hosting to hide some of the traffic there. Uh, it's a pretty scary thing. I think we're going to see more and more of this. Obviously, want to remove those extensions. It also it makes me want to think, God, maybe we should be running more
Run some
models
models.
locally.
Well, I
You
was going to
know,
say on
yeah,
your side and maybe not expose them. And I think a lot
yeah,
about that, and that is tied into that big reprompt vulnerability that we found. I hope our
yeah.
hosts, our producers, could actually drop a link to reprompt in the chat from Varonis Threat Labs. But we identified we Varonis Threat Labs. So Varonis, and we have security researchers who don't do things like work with our customers on incidents that they might have or help support or sell our software. They're entirely focused on doing good for data all over the world. So they're looking for flaws and vulnerabilities in public AI models and SaaS applications and different software that's out there so that we can do responsible disclosure to the vendors that created them and try to plug those holes. And this is what happened with Reprompt. So what Reprompt is a way to bypass Copilot's safety controls that allows an attacker to steal a user's secrets, including their conversation history, and even a fade detection. And it is a single click vulnerability that's actually hosted off of legitimate Microsoft sites. And that's all that's required to compromise users. Now, the attacker even maintains control even when the Copilot chat is closed. So that allows the victim session to be, silently exfiltrating data beyond that first initial click. And what's interesting is that Copilot does have built-in mechanisms in order to prevent this, but hence the name reprompt. What happens is it's passing things over the queue parameter, which allows you to submit a Copilot prompt over a web query. Only that, and the flaw itself is that only that initial prompt and response, or that initial prompt, that first prompt, has all the safety checks in place. So the continued conversation that happens between the attacker server and the Copilot server allows them to get additional data out, whether it's information about like the user and where they live, or their conversation history. Some people are using ChatGPT and Copilot like a therapist, or for medical advice, or for travel information, and all that can be exposed. And what's also really interesting, like unlike other things, this didn't require user input or a Chrome extension to be added or a connector to be like a third-party app to be authorized. Once that user clicks on that initial URL that redirects the first prompt through the attacker server, they get their initial response from that, but then the subsequent conversation happens entirely invisible to the users. It's important to note this is in the free version of Copilot, is where this was found. And my hypothesis, though this hasn't been confirmed by Microsoft, David, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is that they limit that security to that first prompt as a cost and performance control mechanism.
That could be. That could be. I was interested to see how this worked and what this did. And as you noticed, it's all about the queue parameter, not the continuum, but the parameter. And I guess I didn't realize this, but this was something that was included, so you don't have to retype stuff at the prompt when you go to a site. Anything after the Q equal sign is sent to the prompt automatically. So if you get somebody to click on a link that has a bunch of stuff after the queue, then it will be processed by Copilot. And again, that first prompt was checked, but then if part of that instruction was the instruction to go to another website where there's going to be more prompt information, then the subsequent prompts aren't checked. And I wonder whether this is cost savings, or maybe they just hadn't considered this possibility. And I guess the other interesting thing that I was kind of curious about is that once you've got control of that Copilot session, pretty much all that browser information seems to be fair game. And so you can go to other connected services like 365.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of the audit information from those sessions is not as reliably caught, in the different, well, in Graph, for example, in 365. Some of it is a little bit hard to see. So I'm glad this is patched, but I do think that it's another example of wherever you have input that an attacker could manipulate, there are lots of potential issues that you
And
have to worry
I
about.
I would also say too, like there is an element here of that the user has to be aware of the links that they click on, the sources that they come from, right? Like, social engineering continues to be one of the top ways that attacks happen. And ultimately, this is a form, it's a vulnerability in an AI. There is also an element of social engineering here. And so,
Yes.
you want to be careful of the links that you click on and where you click on them. I'm interested to see, first of all, like I wish our Threat Lab team was here for me to say this, but like keep up the great work. Like I hope more
Yeah.
companies are investing time and money into doing good for AI models because we are in the infancy. I think, David, you and I have like hypothesized on the show a bunch of times that like we're still in the crib of AI. We haven't even gotten out of the crib and
Yeah.
started walking yet, let alone become like functioning people in terms of analogous relationship to where we are as society with AI. But I hope more is done to find these flaws and these vulnerabilities, including from Varonis Threat Labs and other companies, before an attacker gets hold of them and uses them, or people make decisions based off of fraudulent conversations, like that leads to negative outcomes, whether for business or for society.
Totally. Got a couple of good questions there.
Yeah,
So I think in order to be vulnerable to this, you had to be using a browser where you were logged into the version of Copilot that was affected.
correct.
And so there was no browser extension required here, but if you were using Edge and you were logged into Copilot and you clicked on one of these links, they're off to the races.
Yep. Let's talk about a couple of vulnerabilities, including a repeat offender. MongoBleed in MongoDB is a vulnerability in MongoDB that's under active exploitation. More than 100,000 potentially vulnerable instances have been identified. CVE 2025 14847 is an unauthenticated remote data leak vulnerability that lets attackers send specifically crafted, malicious packets that cause Mongo database to leak memory and expose private data. Leaked data from those databases could include user information, passwords, API keys, and other sensitive memory fragments. And even large portions of the database can be extracted as because the most active parts of the database are often running in memory as opposed to on disk, or some databases run entirely in memory. But important to note, patches are available. But the other interesting thing is maybe this is the start of many stories, David, is that this vulnerability could be found elsewhere as the underlying software component is Ubuntu's rsync package, as it uses the same Z library component that actually has the flaw in it. So, real interested to see if other companies are found to have this similar bleed vulnerability or memory leak vulnerability. And I thought it was also interesting. I think our producers found some stats that something like 42% of cloud environments have MongoDB running in them.
they have at least one instance of a vulnerable
Oh, of a vulnerable
MongoDB. In
one.
fact,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. Not even just one
So
MongoDB, but one vulnerable one.
yeah,
That's a
it
lot of
because
vulnerable
of
file.
yeah, I guess the flexibility with Mongo. I think it's not like a static schema. You can kind of update schemas on the fly. It's really used for good for shopping databases, for online chat stuff. So the prevalence of it, it was surprising to me how prevalent it is. But I guess it kind of makes sense with all the use cases out there.
And what's going on with N8N? Am I pronouncing that
Uh,
correctly, by the way? Is it
you know,
Naden?
maybe somebody, maybe one of our viewers knows and can chat in how to Nathan.
Yeah, Nathan. I don't know.
But it's an open source automation platform. So think of it like Zapier, but it's kind of a little bit more for tinkerers. Can be run in cloud, can be run on your own hardware, and I believe in one of the recent episodes we did a story about them, but there's a new vulnerability that ranks a 9.9 out of 10. Authenticated users can escalate privileges and do a complete takeover of the instance. And I guess how it works is that N8N can run workflows against input, or what they would call an expression. And the engine the expression engine, the thing that interprets the engine, doesn't sandbox or validate the input appropriately. So if you do the right input as an attacker, you can escape the interpreter and then execute code on the underlying host. You can think of it like a SQL injection or some other remote code execution. But this is in N8N, which is, by the way, a pretty cool tool, it looks like, and good automator, but a patch, right? Another thing we got to patch.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, speaking of things that we got to patch, one more vulnerability to cover, CVE 2025-13915, and again, I'm sure our producers will drop a chat in the chat, is an authentication bypass vulnerability in IBM's API Connect that allows attackers to bypass the authentication mechanism to the API management interface. Though there hasn't been any successful exploitation documented in the wild, an iFix package is available from IBM. And important for you to patch this, as it's a pretty low effort but high impact vulnerability. For those of you that don't know, API Connect is a application API interface that allows people to create and manage IBM's APIs, whether in their cloud or on-prem. It's used by a lot of big companies, and might be something that your organization is running.
Yeah, actually an application. It's an API solution. It allows organizations to create and test and manage secure APIs. So it's
Sure.
actually used by a lot of big companies.
Yeah. Well, let's jump on the highway. David, you were really excited to talk about lobsters.
Well, this one kind of hit me on a few different levels. Everybody's got to love a good heist story. 40,000 pounds of lobster meat that were going to Costco. That's $400,000 worth of lobster got stolen supposedly on its way from a warehouse in Taunton, Massachusetts, to Costco. And 10 days earlier, a huge shipment of crab was stolen from the same place. And the way this worked is, well, they compromised a freight broker's load board account. And what is that? That's where they kind of say, hey, we need this to go here to here. We need this to go here to here. It's kind of a big, I guess, bulletin board of available jobs. So it advertises the stuff that needs to be shipped. And so somebody got, of course, phished, compromised. So they got access to this load board account. And once they had access to the load board account, they were able to create a post to fake shipping jobs. Then real shippers would reply to the post, and they'd get an email with a malicious attachment that looked like a manifest or a PDF description of the job. And that, of course, had malware. And so now they got access to real shippers' data, and they can see what jobs they've got, where they're going. And so apparently somebody thought, I know, let's go pick up the lobsters before the real shippers get there. And so as somebody said, yeah, they got lobstered. And so they just get there. They pose as the real shipper with like the shipping, the logos on the truck, the IDs, and then they just grab the lobster, and they're off to somebody's wedding. I don't know
I
what.
don't know. I mean, David, it sounds to me like if you want to avoid having a crabby day, you probably shouldn't click on fishy links, you know?
Oh,
Um,
that's so unshellfish of you to mention that, but
I mean, look, I was sitting here, you were talking about it, you were passionate about it. I even just came up with those on the fly. I didn't even have those prepared before the show started, but they're probably gonna have to put me on ice because I know we have a couple more stories to go.
indeed.
Hey, David, and you're up again. What's going on with
Oh my God.
Roundup?
All right. So I think we talked about the reactor shell vulnerability on our last episode, or the second one. Um, this is a remote code execution vulnerability in the React service components, or React server components rather. About 90,000 vulnerable instances out there. Looks like there's a botnet that has been exploiting this vulnerability for months. It's called Rondo Docs. And this botnet installs miners. It does a really nice job of killing any other malware out there. It has now this is one of about 50 exploit modules, and it's likely that they have somewhere between 10 and 50,000 nodes by now. So industrial botnet. Moral of the story is update next.js, update this CVE. So it's because some pretty scary folks are using it pretty rapidly.
And Shinyhunted is back again. Trust Wallet confirmed that around 2,500 addresses were drained of about $8.5 million in crypto. The funds being sent to 17 attacker-controlled wallets. The worm Shinyhunted, which we've covered before, infects NPM packages, some of which in this case were linked to Trust Wallet's GitHub secrets. Those leaked secrets allowed attackers to Trojanize API keys in Chrome extensions, and extort funds. So they would, import the API keys that were legit into their own Chrome. Then they were able to authenticate as those users from those leaked keys. Really important that Shy version 3 for the attacker came out on December 28th, but a patch is available to patch against this particular problem. All you have to do is take the latest extension, the latest Trust Wallet Chrome extension to version 2.69.
Another patched moral.
Yeah, now let's talk about like the main story from today. The Shinyhunters becomes the hunted. What's going on here, David?
Yeah, so
It's the honeypot, I know that.
yes, they stumbled into a honeypot, hence the wonderful bee graphic. And I think the interesting thing about this story is that in the honeypot, it wasn't just synthetic data. There was actual real data that had been used in previous breaches that the makers of the honeypot, or the keepers, the beekeepers, the honeypot keepers were using. And this was important because the attackers were pretty good at sussing out the synthetic data. So they the attackers actually bragged about taking over I guess it was the security firm Resecurity is the one that created this realistic looking honeypot. And they bragged about taking it over. And I feel like there must be a meme out there about something like this where you're kind of clearly thinking you did something really cool that it is clearly not. But they managed to connect the attacker to a Gmail account, a Yahoo account, US based phone number, and then law enforcement has this now, and I think it'll be an interesting follow up story the next time. But I think really I'm a big fan of honeypots. I think it's a very effective way to kind of see if there's something going on in the environment. And I guess really the big thing is that how realistic can we make those so that they fool the threat actors that they're
Well,
trying to
and
catch.
honeypots with honey data even is something we've helped our customers with. And I know it's
Hmm.
even covered on some of our other shows like the Data First Forum. Thanks to our co-host David Gibson. as well as you guys, our audience. You are what make State of Cybercrime possible, especially those that attend live on the webinar and those that listen to the recordings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts and YouTube. We super appreciate your viewership or your listenership might even be. So please take a second and answer that feedback poll, and we'll hope to see you on the next episode of State of Cybercrime.
Yeah, thanks very much.